Go.
Good evening, everyone, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope everyone is staying safe and wearing masks in public and reading many biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in 2007. I want to thank Shelby in particular for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event is coming up on October 13th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when Professor David Reynolds will be in conversation with James Oakes about Abraham Lincoln. But tonight we are here to discuss Professor Fredrik Logevall's Volume 1 of his anticipated 2-volume biography of John F. Kennedy. Fredrik Logevall is the Lawrence D. Belfer Professor of International Affairs and Professor of History at Harvard University. I know Fred for his groundbreaking histories of the Vietnam War, his 1999 book, Choosing War, and his 2012 Pulitzer Prize-winning history, Embers of War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam. Two very magisterial histories of that terrible war. Fred has spent the last 8 years, however, becoming a biographer. And I dare say he now realizes that writing biography is so much more arduous than writing mere history, but perhaps more fun. JFK, coming of age in the American century, 1917-1956, spans the first 39 years of JFK's life, from birth through his decision to run for president. And we eagerly await Volume 2. Fred will discuss his biography with another seasoned biographer, David Nasaw, who served as the Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. Professor of History at the Graduate Center until he retired last year. David is best known as a veteran biographer. He has written large biographies of Andrew Carnegie, William Randolph Hearst, and Joseph Kennedy. He's twice been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize and won both the Bancroft Prize and the J. Anthony Lucas Book Prize. And last year, he gave the prestigious annual Leon Levy Lecture on Biography. David has just published an important new book, The Last Million, Europe's Displaced Persons from World War to Cold War. Fred and David will now have a conversation for about 40 minutes and then take questions for 10 or 15 minutes. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions. And we will try to end this program after about 1 hour. And again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. David, I now turn the conversation over to you, but I will rejoin you, I hope, for the Q&A period, when I'll try to throw in at least one question myself. Over to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you. The question I want to start with is the question that I got asked a lot. So I'm going to throw it at you. Why, after an extraordinarily successful career as a diplomatic historian, when I was asked the question, they said as a cultural historian, but why is an extraordinary, I'll say it again, as an extraordinary career, did you decide to embark on a biography? And while you answer the question, you can tell me and tell the audience, are there difficulties that you encountered? Or was it, a piece of cake moving in the direction of a biography where the beginning, the middle, and the end are laid out for you?
It's great to be with you, David. I think that
I think it's partly for me a long-standing interest in John F. Kennedy. Having written about him in other contexts, especially pertaining to the Cold War, foreign policy, Vietnam in particular, I was interested in this guy, and it's of course um, one of the great American stories, the story of the Kennedys, and I think also a long-standing interest in biography as a genre. As my wife will tell you, the pile of books next to our bed often has at least a few biographies in it, and has for a long time. So I think that taking a stab at this, writing a biography, was something I think in the back of my mind for a long time. And I think I'd love to hear what you think about this too, David. I think that in some ways the transition from writing history, even if it was often history with a biographical component, which is to say, potted biographies of a lot of the players in my history works. In some ways, I think the transition was maybe less difficult than I imagined. Part of the reason for that is that this book tries to be both a biography of JFK and also a history of the age in which he rose to prominence. So there's a strong historical component to it anyway. But I don't know what you think, but I think that we depend in many respects on the same kinds of things in history and biography. It's about obviously archival evidence. It's about context. At least the way I want to write this biography, context is crucial, and not letting our evidence go further than it would otherwise allow. I think there are differences, but probably more similarities than I thought.
Yeah, no, I would agree entirely. I remember after I wrote my first biography, I spoke to a assemblage of biographers, much as this audience, which probably has a lot of biographers. And I remember saying, and they didn't like it, that there was a certain ease in writing a biography because, as I said earlier, you don't have to organize the chapters in the same way.
Yeah.
You know that you're going to talk about childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, on and on. But the difficult thing I found was the attempt, the struggle to be fair to a living or once living individual. I mean, there's an extra burden I felt.
Yeah.
Did you experience that as well?
I think that's right, and I think the other challenge, I think, David, is that maybe it's partly that JFK is to some extent elusive, or has been for other biographers, and though I like to think that I got closer to him than others have, there's a limit to how close we can get to another human being, except perhaps in fiction. But certainly in nonfiction, I think there's a limit. So that's the other challenge here. I do think you're right, though, about the organizational dimension, that at least if you're writing what we might call a fairly conventional biography that begins with, in my case, with the arrival of the Kennedys and the Fitzgeralds in the 19th century, nevertheless is really beginning with his birth in a serious way and then moving forward. It in some ways organizes itself, doesn't it? Yeah.
Let's talk about the book. I'll say this. I don't want to say this for the next 45 minutes, but let me begin by saying it's an extraordinarily exceptional book. I have read hundreds of biographies. I am a critic of biographies because I always want to believe I could have done it as well or better. But not in this case. This is an extraordinary book in large part because you don't simply throw in the context. We learn more about, to give one example, appeasement and the run-up to World War II from a historian than we would, I think, from a biographer who is not a historian. Now, I don't mean by historian, you have to have a PhD or teach in a university. It's a mindset. It's a sensitivity. It's a push to get it right, to say something new. And you did that throughout. The other thing that I want to talk about, and one of the difficulties of writing a biography, is that you're in two time frames at the same time.
Yeah.
You want to recreate the life as lived by your subject, but at the same time, you know what's going to happen. So let me give you one example, and let's talk about it. In October of 1939, Jack Kennedy writes an unsigned, is it not, editorial in the Harvard, in the Harvard Crimson, and he's wrong on everything. Yeah. Okay, so it's your task to tell us why he said this, but then you can't leave it at that. You got to tell us why he might have gotten it wrong.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that moment?
Yeah, well, that's a really good example. And of course, there are countless others, David. And you've encountered this in your own exceptional biographies, not least with respect to Joe Kennedy. So for people who may not know, David's biography, The Patriarch, is a monumental work, one that was really important to me, especially in the first, let's say the first half in particular of this book, although of course Joe Sr. is there throughout, and he'll be there throughout Volume 2 as well. Yeah, I think it's a challenge. And in that particular case, he comes back, Jack does, from this quite amazing, effectively a study abroad experience, but one that lasts for about 7 months earlier in 1939, in which he crisscrosses really all over Europe, to some extent the Middle East, with his father's help, as you know, David, and speaks to lots of important people. He's in Berlin just a few days before the war breaks out, before the German invasion of Poland. And he begins, I think, and I show this, begins to separate himself from his father. His father remains, I think, an arch appeaser, very much wants to keep the United States out of the struggle. And JFK, unlike his older brother Joe Jr., is already beginning, I think, to shift toward a more interventionist position. Nevertheless, this op-ed or this editorial in the Harvard Crimson comes out, very much parroting his father's views. And so I struggled with the evidence that I was getting that he was shifting from the old man, as compared to this unsigned editorial. And of course, he was lucky that it was unsigned, because he would come to regret his arguments in the op-ed. But as you say, it's a challenge to explain it. Where did it come from? Why did he write it? How do we make sense of this in terms of what's going on more broadly, both at Harvard, which is an interesting story in terms of student opinion and faculty opinion, but his own gradually changing views. It was tough.
Talk about the sentiment at Harvard writ large and at the rest of the country regarding entry into the war, either in support of the British early or with our own troops much later.
Yeah, it surprised me in doing research on this that the student body in 37, 38, 39, even into the spring of 40 when he graduates, was vociferously isolationist, to use the term of the day, anti-interventionist, much more so than I thought. There's polling done by the Harvard Crimson, which I quote, which suggests that 90% of the students in the fall of 1939, which is when he pens his op-ed, is starkly opposed even to aiding the British and the French, never mind becoming the United States becoming a belligerent. So that surprised me. I think in terms of the the broader populace, I would say, and there may be historians who disagree with me on this, but my finding is that among public opinion generally, there's also a strong aversion still in the fall of 39 well into 1940 against providing large-scale assistance to the British and the French, never mind, again, the US becoming involved. I think what really changes it, David, is the fall of France. I think June of 1940 is a kind of watershed as I see it. I think it changes FDR's plans. I think it changes how Americans view this struggle. All of a sudden, if the French can fall in 6 weeks to the Germans, and the British are in all likelihood next, what does it mean for us here? I think that's a very important moment. And that's, of course, when Jack Kennedy graduates from Harvard and when he publishes what had been his senior thesis and now comes out as a book. Perfect timing for him. But that's really when it seems to me the shift occurs in an important way.
Yeah. How do you, one of the mysteries of Jack Kennedy is this transformation from the carefree, sloppy playboy to the serious guy. When he enters Harvard, he's a C student?
Yeah.
And then when he leaves, he writes this extraordinary thesis that his faculty advisors say is too long. I mean, he put too much into it.
Yeah. I think this is really interesting to me. I do suggest that there's a serious, maybe serious is the wrong word. There's an inquisitive part of him that comes out even a little bit at Choate in his prep school. In some of we don't have very many papers left, but in the Choate archives and to some extent at the Kennedy Library, you can see some of his papers from prep school, and you can see a kind of emerging, certainly a deep interest in history and in politics and in statecraft. Let's remember he had been sick a lot as a child, became a kind of voracious reader in part because of his mother's urging. I think Rose is really quite important in this story. But you're right. The first couple of years at Harvard, he's pretty content to just coast along. He attaches way more importance to getting into a final club than he does to his studies. And then partly, I think, as a result of these travels that we've been discussing, and maybe a sense that he can contribute to this in some way, some unanticipated way to some degree, he changes. And I think the senior thesis, which I actually look at in some detail, is emblematic of this shift in the young Jack Kennedy, really in 39-40. But I guess the point I would say here is just that there is a seriousness to him from an early point. I'm struck by the fact that there are these papers that he's interested even at Harvard in the question of democracy. Can democracy survive? What is required of a democracy to flourish? Questions that I think still have resonance for us, for us today. He's already then caring about those kinds of things.
One comes away from this book with a renewed admiration for the man's ability to write, his use of language, and his extraordinary sense of humor.
Yeah.
I mean, talk to us about that. Did that surprise you?
I mean, some of that, of course, we know. Bob Dalek's biography, others have written about some of these things. And I think that the sense of humor, it's hard for me to exaggerate how important it would be, including, I think, in his success as a politician. But we see it in some of these letters home when he's 12, 13, 14 years old. It's there early. It continues to be there. And it's something I guess I had a sense of, but was brought home to me much more so in the course of the research. And let me say, by the way, something that the materials at the Kennedy Library, including in the Joe Kennedy papers, which very few people prior to your work, in fact, nobody nobody had or has used the papers in the way that you have in your biography. But the correspondence that the family carried on in the late 1930s through 1945 is just, from a biographer and a historian's perspective, it is a real gold mine. And we see this side of Jack Kennedy from early on.
But there's also, I mean, the family letters are terrific, but Lem Billings is, you know, he's a gift not only to Kennedy, but to his biographers. Talk a little bit about Lem.
Yeah, well, the relationship it's a very important friendship that they establish when they're both at Choate. And I think there's a kind of mutual dependence. I think that the friendship is more important to Lem than it is to Jack, but not by that much. And I think that there is this correspondence that they carry on. And I think that even when it becomes clear that Lem Billings is gay, and I think this is, of course, very much to Jack's credit, they remain close friends. They're really, Billings is really his closest friend right down to the end, I would say, in Dallas. Torbert McDonald is important. There are others who enter the picture. But I think Lem Billings is sort of primus inter pares throughout. And I think that the relationship between the two of them, the closeness, is really an important part of the story, no question.
Yeah, and the correspondence.
Yeah,
we learn so much about Jack from these letters.
Yeah, we do. We really do. And of course, that's, you know, I would also say that about maybe one other set of letters. His sister Kathleen, known as Kick. The letters between the two of them, and of course she's killed in a plane crash in 1948. This is a guy who experiences a lot of tragedy, a family that does, of course. But she was really his soulmate, I think, among all the siblings. She was the one that he felt closest to, and the letters between them I think, are really important. To a lesser extent, also Joe Sr. It's a somewhat complicated relationship with the older brother. And you know, David, anticipating volume 2, I will have an embarrassment of materials for volume 2, especially when he becomes president. What I don't think I won't have the same kind of family correspondence. I won't have nearly as many letters that are signed by Jack Kennedy himself.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be an interesting challenge for me, and I don't know how this will go, but is he going to be more and more removed as he rises higher and higher in politics? Maybe not, because of the other kinds of sources that I can tap, but I certainly won't have this kind of correspondence with somebody like Lem Billings. They remain close, but at least as far as I've seen to this point, far fewer letters between them when JFK becomes president. Letters between the family members and JFK also far less numerous.
He takes his role as president very seriously,
Yeah.
and he can no longer banter and joke,
Yeah.
and talk about his sexual exploits in the way he does with Lem. One of the reasons this book works so well is, I mean, you've got an extraordinary subject, the personal life story, the illnesses. Talk about his personal illnesses and his. I don't know if it's a struggle. He's in his letters. He seems to take this as who he is, a man who is going to go from fever to fever, from illness to illness.
Yeah, there's not a lot of self-pity in the letters, and to some extent, I'm sure that's a front. You know, I'm sure that he felt fear at times. You don't see very much of it in the letters, Yeah, I mean, I think he was sickly as a baby, and was suffered maladies really from then to the end of his days. Addison's disease, of course, was the most important ailment. Diagnosed only in 1947, though he certainly suffered from it before the official diagnosis by a British doctor. Um, but I guess the kind of contradiction. I don't know if you have a thought on this, because you know this story well yourself. What's remarkable about it is that this same sickly John F. Kennedy had more energy on the campaign trail, just to use that as an example. 1946, when he runs for the House. 1952, when he takes on the mighty Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. for the Senate seat. 1960, of course, first the primary campaign, then the race with Nixon in the fall. This is a guy who will go 12, 14, 16, 18 hours a day. He will completely exhaust his advisors and his aides. It speaks, I think, to his ambition, to his determination, but it also suggests to me that as important as his sicknesses and his health problems are, I don't think we should exaggerate their scope in the end, because he is the Kennedy energy. There's something about this family he's got in spades, and then this determination to prevail is amazing.
It's remarkable. I mean, earlier biographies have talked about his father's money and his father's advice and his father's guidance. Some have even referred to him as as the puppet, with the father pulling the strings. But what becomes clear here, especially clear, is that Jack becomes his own man, and he becomes his own man early. And when he decides he's going to go into politics, he puts 1,000% of himself into it. And the only other, as a PT boat commander, he's the same way. In every other aspect of his life, till then, he seems to be totally lackadaisical.
Yeah, he does. And I don't say this in the book. I do wonder a little bit about if Joe Jr.'s passing, or what role that might have played. So he's killed in 44. And of course, Jack runs in 46. I show in the book that well before Joe Jr.'s death, certainly by early 1942, with his girlfriend, in some ways, somebody he loved very deeply, Inga Arvad, he's already musing about running for political office. But I do sometimes wonder if that determination that we see, especially then when he enters politics, has anything to do, or is further spurred by his brother's death. But I think you make a very important point, which is that though he's very devoted to his father throughout his life, the two are very close, and his father is important in his campaigns, no question about it. I think the evidence is pretty strong that I present, that he is, as you say, his own master. He doesn't really trust his father's political judgments. So in the campaigns, when there's a difference or disagreement, it's Jack. Even when he's 29 and running for the House, it's Jack's view that prevails between the two of them. And I think that's important.
Yeah, and I think Joe, the father, quickly realizes that. He realizes that Jack has gone way beyond him. Certainly by 52.
Yeah. You know what's interesting, and this is something you write about too, is that this difference, this worldview, this political philosophy that the two of them have, the differences that emerges, as I suggested earlier, already in 39 and 40, kind of continues, it seems to me. And I think this is something that comes out in your biography of Joe, that even after the war, Joe is in some ways just as isolationist as he was before, I think. Sees the Cold War very differently. Jack, as I suggest, is an early Cold Warrior. And in fact, one could argue that the view that Joe Kennedy Sr. has about the Soviet-American confrontation, which is basically the Soviets are not going to invade anybody. The Soviets are not out to conquer the West. Stalin understands as well as anybody else that he's weaker vis-a-vis the West than we're suggesting. It's a point of view that I think more than a few historians, I think, would come to share, though they may differ with Joe Kennedy on a whole range of other things. That difference between father and son is, I think, fascinating. And I think it's to Joe's credit that he does not say to his son, look, we need to agree on this. You need to follow what I'm suggesting on X, Y, or Z policy issue. He doesn't do that at all.
Yeah. Oh God, I have so many things I want to talk about. But let's jump to one area. The trip to Asia. We've already talked about the one-person fact-finding trips that he makes while he's in college. Is it the summer of 51? Summer of 51.
More the fall of 51.
He goes to Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Talk about that and talk about what comes out of that.
It's a long trip. They cover about 25,000 miles. It's Jack, it's Bobby, and it's Patricia. So 3 siblings. And they visit probably 8 or 10 countries. And I found this, and he keeps a diary, which I think we haven't talked about. The diaries that Jack Kennedy kept off and on, I think, and they're available at the Kennedy Library, are wonderful as resources. But they visit these countries. And of course, it's in anticipation of his expected run the next year against Henry Cabot Lodge. He wants to beef up his foreign policy credentials, and so they do this. The trip is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, he and Bobby, who have not been particularly close before this, because there's an 8.5 year age gap between them, and so they didn't have a lot of time when they were younger to spend time together to get to know one another. Now they do. And I think there's an important bond established here on this trip that will matter to the end of their days. Second thing is that, as you point out, they spend time in Indochina, and I think they see, both of them, and Patricia too, all 3 of them see, that the French policy just is not succeeding, and nor is it likely to succeed. And I opened my last book, Embers of War, with them there in 51, ironically. And to suggest something that I'm going to explore in volume 2, which is that there's a paradox in that JFK, I believe, from 51, if not before, was always skeptical that Western military power can succeed in this part of the world, can thwart Ho Chi Minh's revolution. And I don't think that skepticism ever went away. But the paradox, of course, is that this same JFK, as president, expands U.S. involvement quite dramatically, not like Johnson does, but quite dramatically, especially in 62. And so I have to grapple with that paradox. I think a key aspect of it is in domestic politics. That I think he felt the kind of vulnerability to charges of being soft on communism that Democrats, as you know, felt in the Cold War. I think that's part of what's going on here. But in 51, he has, I think, far-sighted ideas about communism, what it takes to defeat communism, how the U.S. should respond to decolonization, to these emerging nations in various parts of the world. Shows again, I think, his seriousness as a thinker, in this case, about foreign policy.
When he comes back from Vietnam, his father makes sure or encourages him to go on a press campaign, which he does. And what does he say? What does he say about Vietnam? Well,
I think these are really, and you can see, by the way, folks, some of these on YouTube. You can see when he goes on Meet the Press, and you can see when you certainly have a transcript of when he appears before the Boston Chamber of Commerce. And what he says, I mean, there's a lot there, but he says forthrightly that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but we, America, we, the United States, we are on the wrong side of history. if we try to bolster what the French are attempting to do. If the French do not move toward giving the Vietnamese their independence in a timely fashion, we should not be supporting what they're doing. And so I think the same message comes through after he returns that we see in these diary entries and in Bobby's diary entries. The other thing that's worth noting about this is that you see in Joe Kennedy encouraging him to do this. Joe's understanding that television is going to be of monumental importance in American politics. I think from his days in Hollywood, which you deal with in your biography, Joe had a sense of the importance of image building and of presentation. He wanted his kids to be comfortable in front of the camera. That's now, I think, expanded as he thinks about Jack running for the Senate. And he believes, I think, that my second son, Jack Kennedy, can be president. I think he already believes that here in late 1951.
Yeah. But in 51, is Jack worried about, when he comes back from Vietnam, about speaking out in a way that he might be attacked as being soft on communism? Or has he built a record as a anti-communist so that he doesn't have to worry?
Well, it's a really good question. And I wanted a better answer to that in some ways than I think I was able to find. I think that he has established from 47, from the time he enters Congress, which is right when the Cold War begins, I think he has established a very, from his perspective, strong voting record on anti-Soviet policy. So he, I think, feels that he's established those credentials. But I think it's to his credit that in the course of 51, and I do deal with this in the book, he begins to shift and he begins to say, look, there's a whole big world out there and a developing world, a lot of newly liberated nations. And we cannot simply make this about communism versus anti-communism. We've got to speak to people where they live. I think he feels, David, that he can do that and still affirm his strong anti-Soviet position, especially with respect to Western and Central Europe, and look at things a little differently in the rest of the world.
When he runs against Lodge, does he have a foreign policy agenda that stands out or distinguishes him?
Not really. I mean, one of the curious things about this race is that the two are very much alike. And they, in fact, share a lot of things in common, having been to Harvard, having dabbled with journalism, having a reputation for grace under pressure, being gracious in terms of their interpersonal relations. And there are not that many, I think, important policy differences between them. They both look for ways to manufacture issues. So JFK will hit Lodge for his poor voting record in Congress, which is pretty rich, coming from somebody who wasn't exactly present for a lot of votes himself. And Lodge is looking for his issues. McCarthy, we haven't talked about Joe McCarthy, but they both have a hard time figuring out in this campaign in 52, how are we going to deal with this guy? Because McCarthy is, of course, riding high in 52. And there are a lot of Irish Catholics in Massachusetts. Both of them are sensitive to that fact. But no, I don't think there are important differences between the two of them on broad issues of foreign policy.
Does, between 1944 and 1946, in three brief years, Gene Kennedy once told me, or Gene Kennedy Smith, that there wasn't one Kennedy family, there were three families. There were the older kids through Kick, there were the middle kids, and then she and Teddy were the babies. Between 1944 and 1946, the family loses Rosemary, who is no longer part of the family. Joe Jr. and Kick died. What's the effect on the making of this man?
Yeah, it's a stunning part of all of this to think about the botched lobotomy. I'm not sure that they can ever be, non-botched, but the surgery that went horribly awry in late 1941. So he effectively lost the sibling who was closest to him in age, Rosemary, born, I think, about 18 months after him. Then, as you say, Joe Jr. in the war in 44, in what turned out to be a pointless mission. And then Kick in 1948. I mean, I think it was, there was a kind of golden trio of kids, golden quartet if you included Rosemary, but Rosemary had, developmental challenges from birth. The other three were considered, I think, by the parents, by others who were friends of the family, they were the golden trio. And now he was the only one who remained. And I think, among other things, it did give him a sense. We know this from his letters, from what he said to Lem Billings, what he said to Torbert McDonald and others. You've got to live each day like it could be your last. And I think it drove him. I think it made him more determined, since he didn't think he might have that long because of his illnesses. He said to people, "I may only live till I'm 45," which actually was a pretty good estimate in the end. I've got to just go for it with all I've got, and I think that's what he does. Certainly in his political campaigns.
We're going to take questions in a little while, so in a very short time. So if you have questions, please go to the Ask a Question link at the bottom of your screen and write down your question, and we'll get to it in about 5 minutes. Has there ever been a president as well prepared for the presidency as John Fitzgerald Kennedy, young as he was?
Certainly there have been few. I think you could make an argument for the elder Bush. I suppose that George H.W. Bush, when he ascended to the presidency, was extremely well prepared for the office. And there are others we could add to that list.
You talk about Quincy Adams.
Yeah, well, yes. And in fact, the early preparation that Jack Kennedy had, maybe especially in 1939, we keep coming back to that year, but it's of course a hugely important one. But the preparation that Jack Kennedy got then, long before he was even finished at Harvard, never mind ran for political office, I think the closest analog, would be John Quincy Adams, who as a young man had similar preparation. I think what it means, though, is that by the time we get into 1960, this guy who was perceived by some voters, maybe a fair number of voters, as being too inexperienced, as too young, as a pretty face, but maybe not all that much more, I think, in fact, was extremely well prepared for this. He made his share of mistakes as president, and I'll detail those in volume 2. This is a warts and all picture of this man that I'm giving. But I do think he was ready for this. He always believed, interesting in our own age, in preparation. He always believed in knowing his stuff, and he didn't suffer aides who didn't know their stuff down to the closest details. We see this even in the Senate. And Ted Sorensen, we haven't talked about, who was so important to him. Sorensen learned early on, I got to know my stuff because he knows his stuff. And I think that when he gets to run for the presidency, when we get the debates, the other day I looked at the first TV debate again, as I'm sure did many other people after what we saw here. And you see this guy, both of them, Nixon too. Nixon is very experienced, but you see the level of preparation. And I think you're right, David. I think he entered the presidency in 61. Whatever mistakes he made, very well prepared for the office, especially probably in foreign policy, but overall too.
Okay, it's just one final question for me for now.
Yeah.
Inga Arvad
Hmm.
relationship. There are two ways biographers have handled that, either as a salacious interlude in an otherwise, political story. But you go much, much beyond that. This is an important moment and a very important relationship for Jack.
Yeah, I think it was. I think that, I suggest a few times in the manuscript that there's a romantic inside this Kennedy persona that I think is important, and it comes out in part through the relationship with her. I think he loved her deeply. I think he regretted when, through his father's pressure, he broke off the relationship. And then as I detail, he tried at various points to resume it, and she was no longer interested. I think she was important to him in several ways. I think he admired the fact that she was so cosmopolitan, that she knew all these languages. He always had a tin ear for languages. So Inga and later Jackie, the fact that they could speak other languages was something that impressed him. She also was good for, I think, his self-confidence, because she saw in him, even as young as he was, 25 years old, somebody who had the makings of greatness. And we know this from letters. And by the way, we know this from FBI surveillance and from tapes.
We must
she was a
thank the
suspected
FBI.
spy.
Yeah.
We have these extraordinary transcripts of FBI surveillance of the two of them, and you can hear them speaking. And I think she was very important to his self-confidence. And she was certainly, until he met Jackie, she was really the love of his life.
Would he have taken her, if she had taken him back? Would he have defied his father and put his political career into?
It's a very large question. Perhaps he wouldn't have. So when he pines for her and he wants to resume the relationship, and he calls her, at 1 o'clock in the morning when he lands, and the FBI is monitoring the phone calls, so we know what they say. It seems like he is completely head over heels, and he wants her back, whatever. But when you play this out, she's been married. She is older than he is. She's a suspected spy, and even after that, becomes pretty clear that she's not a spy. That's not a very good trifecta. And so if he does develop, as he does, these political ambitions, perhaps it's not a long-term thing, but I do think he was genuinely pained, heartbroken even, in 43 when he's away in the war. His letters to her from the South Pacific, and then for time thereafter, I think he is mad for her.
Yeah. Let me go to the questions. There are two questions about Jack's relationship to his father. One references anti-Semitism. What do we know about what JFK thought about his father's attitudes and actions towards Jews? That's the first question. Let me give them both to you and you can answer.
Yep.
He, in many books they talk about, and certainly in yours, is JFK being very different from his father. Who allegedly said, the father, they didn't understand Jack. He's more like his mother. He's more like his mother. Is Jack, how is he, is that at all true? And talk again about how he's different from his father in personality, in outlook.
Yeah, I mean, on the first question, David, you should chime in here with your own views. I think that the anti-Semitism of Joe Sr. Is, at least for me, somewhat hard to categorize, but I would certainly say that he's anti-Semitic. And you've written, I think, in your biography, You've handled this, it seems to me, really well. I see in Joe Jr. many of those same characteristics that the father possesses. And Joe Jr., if anything, goes even farther than his father does in expressing admiration for Nazi Germany, talking about how the Germans are going to get what they want and what they deserve, and complaining about the fact that FDR is so much under the influence of Jews and so forth. Jack, I don't think I see nearly this. In fact, I don't see any evidence of this that I have found, which is interesting. And I don't think he feels that same prejudice. I don't think he's, generally speaking, a person who feels a lot of prejudice in general, by the way. So that's a comment there, and you should chime in as well. But on the broader point, I think he is in many respects closer to his mother in his personality. He is more, there's a shyer aspect to him that Joe Sr. does not possess. Rose is more interested in history, in books, than Joe Sr. is, and she passes that on to Jack. There's a certain emotional reserve that Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy has that Jack, at least to some extent, has as well. A passion for politics that she gets in part from Honey Fitzgerald, her father, that I think Jack possesses, which I think is important. I think even as we think about Kennedy's legacy for today, that belief of his in politics, that belief that government can help us solve big problems, can speak to society's highest aspirations. I think that's important, a message for today. And I think that comes more from Rose than it does from Joe. I think he's closer to Rose. But how would you respond to the anti-Semitism?
Well, there is no doubt that Joe is an anti-Semite.
Yeah.
Having said that, however, the real question is, what kind of an anti-Semite is he?
Yeah.
Because in the period in which he's operating, certainly in the 30s and the 40s, he's not alone. He's very comfortable in his anti-Semitism. He goes off the deep end during the war because he thinks the war that the Jews are pushing to fight a war to save the Jews. And he makes some outrageous anti-Semitic comments. Yeah. I'm sure he knows better, or he should know better, but he repeats all the old myths, the hated myths about Jews.
And when he said at one point to you have this too, when he says to Harvey Clemmer, one of his aides, about the Jews, he says, well, they brought it on themselves. That's
in the book I just did about the displaced persons, you find out that the anti-Semitism, we think of the anti-Semitism in the State Department, but the anti-Semitism in the British Foreign Office and in the circles that Joe is keeping in Great Britain is just frightening. Hey, there's one more question here.
Mm-hmm.
This person wants to know about his annulled marriage. Was there an annulled marriage? What are the rumors? Is there any evidence of this?
I looked, I think, quite exhaustively for this because, of course, I had seen references to it. Relatively few. Most people don't touch this issue. I could not find any evidence, none, that there was a secret marriage that was then annulled. And so it's not, therefore, something that I don't even have it in an endnote. I decided not to go there at all. So I couldn't find any evidence at all of this.
Right. His relationship to women, though, you don't shy away from talking about it.
No,
and you
I
make
think
it clear that this is a significant part of who this man was.
Yeah, I think so. And one of the things I've said in another talk is that, because he's his father's son here to a large extent, that I have recognized, David, that I can't have it both ways. If I'm going to say that he's his own man when it comes to politics and career choices and philosophy of governance and so on, and he's able to distance himself from his father on those areas, he should have been able to do the same thing here. But he didn't. I do think that and you write about this yourself, that Joe Kennedy carrying on with innumerable women in the 20s and the 30s, just as Joe Jr. and Jack are coming of age. I think it was a very confusing time for them when he started hitting on Jack's girlfriends, at least on occasion. You know, I think it was hard, but there's no denying the fact that like his father, he tended to see women as objects to be conquered. He, in many areas of his life, had empathy, which is to say, I think he was able to partly because of his ailments, he was able to put himself in other people's shoes. Mattered a lot at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Where he didn't show empathy, maybe he didn't show emotional empathy, was on this issue, especially with respect to Jackie. Because,
it is
of course,
stunning the ways in which Jackie, you chronicle this, you talk about it. Jackie is warned by Jack's friends.
Yeah, by Lemon.
Do you know what you're getting into?
Yeah.
And Torbert too, didn't he say something?
He might have as well. The one that comes to mind is that Lem. In particular. But you know, her own father, she talked about this in letters and to friends. Her own father was a chronic womanizer. She said, "This is what men do. They don't mean anything terrible about it, but it's sort of in their nature." I think when it then happened right away after the wedding, and even to some extent before, I think it was much harder for her than maybe she had thought it was going to be. The mother,
Rose, there's a time when Jack says, as Rose goes away for a long vacation, what is it?
Yeah, some mother you are, leaving your kids alone. He's about 6 years old at the time.
Yeah, and what's even more remarkable is Rose puts that in her memoirs.
Yeah.
You know, you would think that she would want to hide that.
That was the last thing she would want. Yeah, no, but she puts it in there, I think, to show. It's just partly when she talks about his way with words and his sense of humor and how quick he was, and so she wants to talk about it in that context. It's maybe more revealing though than she fully understands in putting it in her memoir. They did have a somewhat complicated relationship, the two of them, partly because of this tendency of hers to take these long trips by herself often, even if one can understand why she might do that.
In the end, do you come away after these years of research and writing and rewriting and rewriting? Are there surprises? Are there things you didn't know about this man? Have you reassessed or reevaluated your impressions of?
I think that I think that this would be a long answer, but I'll just give you one or two. I think that I went into this having, of course, read other biographies, though we have fewer actual biographies of this man than one might think, even though we have endless books on aspects of his life and his presidency. But I think I went in.
Assassination.
Yes, that's right. I think that I went in thinking that the callow playboy JFK was probably, you know, the correct depiction of him until maybe he got into the House, maybe even until he got to the Senate. And I think what I came away with from this research was this sense, as we've discussed, that he was inquisitive. There was an emerging seriousness about the great issues of the day from an earlier point. And then I think the second thing I would say, which we've also discussed, is a greater willingness to separate himself from his father at an earlier point than I thought was the case. I never bought into the idea that he was a puppet and that Joe Kennedy was just sort of pulling him wherever he wanted to go. That seemed to me far-fetched. But I think that still didn't fully grasp his ability to do what Joe Jr. was always unwilling to do, unable to do, which is to separate himself from the old men.
Terrific. Kai, are you there somewhere? Do you have a final question?
Yes, I am here. This has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you, guys. My question is a biographer's question. Fred, I'm interested in the archives and the JFK archive. The last time I did any serious work there, it was for my biography of McGeorge Bundy.
Of Bundy, yeah.
And this is in the 1990s, and the JFK library was rather notorious for being known for having so many closed collections.
Yeah.
So, for instance, I think like Bobby Kennedy's diaries were closed, and a lot of Bobby Kennedy's papers, and a lot of other discrete collections were just not open. So I'm interested in how you, as a biographer 20 years later, have benefited. What new stuff has suddenly opened that you benefited from in writing this biography, and what is still being withheld?
It's really good. And I will say, as a point of introduction, that the library has been extremely helpful to me. The archivists are fabulous, and I have been able to get so much help. And by the way, even though the library is closed, as we were discussing before we came on the air, the archivists are actually at work, and so one can email them, and they've been tremendous. I think, Kai, that there are still collections that have not been processed that I would have liked to see. Torbert MacDonald's papers, for example, I was not able to see, to just cite but one. There are aspects of other collections that we haven't gotten access to. I think we all owe David, our host tonight, a debt of gratitude, because the Joe Kennedy papers were a goldmine for me, as I said earlier. And it was in part, substantial part, I think, because of David's efforts that they were open to everybody. I think before, if I'm right about this, David, they were available sort of on a case-by-case basis, perhaps, but now anybody can go to the Kennedy Library down the street from me and see these papers. The Jackie Kennedy papers are a work in progress, I believe, but I got some terrific stuff, some of it right near the end, Kai, from her papers that I was able to slot in pretty late late in the game. And so it's been overall really positive for me. I think for volume 2, I have some work to do to try to get more stuff made available, not just at Kennedy, but elsewhere as we get into the presidential years. There's intelligence material, CIA and other stuff that I want to get my hands on that at least I haven't been able to see to this point. I'd love, by the way, we're probably out of time, but when we talk about your Carter book in a few months, to throw this question back to you and to hear your sense of the materials for the Carter library and elsewhere, it'd be so much fun to talk about.
It's always a treasure hunt for biographers, isn't it? When we stumble across new material. It's terrific. Well, this has been absolutely fabulous. It will be up on the web forever, and people will be able to consult and drop in later. Anyway, I want to thank both of you, Fred and David, for doing this, and remind everyone that our next event is on October 13th at 6 p.m., the same time, with David Reynolds talking about Abraham Lincoln. So on that note, thank you and good evening.
Thank you.